Several weeks ago, as some of you may know, a mini-series was released covering the modernized take on the lives of Mary Villiers, her son George Villiers, and his relationship with the notoriously gay King James VI and I of Scotland and England. Based on a true story, the series starring Julianne Moore as Mary, James played by Tony Curran, and my guy Nicholas Galitzine as George, covers the tale of how Mary, later the Countess of Buckingham, raised George to seduce King James, and through his role as royal lover and favorite, ensure the family's power and financial stability. When I tell people about gay-ass King James, they often find it really hard to believe. What? There was a King of England who was gay and everyone just kinda knew about it? They were just cool with that? And what's up with all of his problematic boyfriends? Well, of course, in a markedly homophobic society, who else but the literal monarch believed appointed to his role by God can get away with being relatively openly gay? I mean, not that he was openly gay to the public, but if you knew, you knew. But James is a fascinatingly complicated character, as was George, and the show Mary and George doesn't quite get into the details of James's character a whole lot, instead choosing to focus on, well, Mary and George, which is fine, but how about we take a turn through the real history and see the bigger picture, what the whole story is with both James and George, and then we can come back and see just how close the show made it to the mark. Come learn with me. Disclaimer, obvious spoiler alert for the centuries-long nonfiction stories of James and George as covered in the show. And the show itself. Also, I'm not actually dogging on the show for getting things wrong in like a CinemaSins type fashion or whatever. I frankly don't care, unless it's egregious. It's a funny modern retelling and is entitled to artistic license. Also, new month, new channel charity. This month's channel charity isn't exactly thematically connected to royal history or whatever, but it is still vitally important right now. The Palestinian Children's Fund. Now more than ever, the people of Gaza need our support in whatever form that takes, and the Palestinian Children's Fund is a great way to help give to an organization directly helping people, especially children in need. Right now, we all need to be doing our part to help out the people protesting for Palestine, as well as, of course, the people in Palestine, and raising awareness, and really, a lot of these people just need money and relief efforts, and it's a very difficult thing for them to come across right now. I have made a donation, and if you have the means, I encourage you to do the same. Just a quick side tangent here while I'm editing. My ring light broke, so I had to rely on natural lighting from my window, and unfortunately it was a very sunny day with lots of clouds moving over the sun, so the lighting changes wildly throughout this video. I'm doing the best I can to fix it, but I apologize in advance. So, now let's get into learning. But first, a word from today's sponsor, Aura. Online privacy is now more important than ever, especially with how many bad actors are floating around online with easy access to your data, which is easily purchased from any number of data brokers. In a matter of minutes, anyone can find your email, phone number, full name, and home address, and you would never know. That's why I started using Aura, which is an all-in-one system that protects both my information and removes my data from various data broker sites automatically by submitting opt-out requests for me. Since I got my own info taken care of, I tried searching for info on one of my friends to see what came up at their request, of course, and unsurprisingly, it was super easy to find their info. They were absolutely shocked and uncomfortable, and as soon as I got them set up on Aura, the search results began to filter away. It's especially scary because recently, AT&T customer data was leaked to the dark web, and of course, they advised customers to change and protect passwords, but I have Aura to take care of all of that and more for me. Between password protection, security scans, spam reduction, credit checks, and credit locking, and more, I can rely on Aura to keep my info safe without the hassle of downloading a bunch of different apps. I value my privacy and I value yours. You can go to aura.com/Kazro to start your 2-week free trial, also linked below in the description. Thank you so much to Aura for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to learning about King James and his favorites. In 1565, Mary Queen of Scots was wed to Henry Stuart. Henry was, well, kind of an asshole. For one thing, he had an inferiority complex to his new wife, mostly because he wanted to rule as king equally alongside her, which he eventually won, but he never won the hearts of his people, nor the court. Hence why, to this day, he is not usually called Henry King of Scots, but rather Lord Darnley. Mary, on the other hand, had been Queen of Scots literally her entire life. She'd had 23 years for people to warm up to her, which, to be fair, they sort of didn't, and Mary herself was actually not even really a fan of Scotland. Raised in the French court for the most part, so that'll do it to ya. For reasons of differing religions, shocking nobody, people in Scotland really did not like Mary. So the marriage was an unhappy one for numerous reasons, a major one being that Mary was getting really close to her new Italian secretary, Signor David Riccio. Between jealousy and the political upheaval this caused, Henry crafted a plan to murder Riccio. He and a number of other lords burst into the room where Mary and Riccio were eating, swords drawn. Riccio took cover behind Mary, his hands on her pregnant belly. After a scuffle, Riccio was pulled away and stabbed to death. Thus, Mary was effectively imprisoned in her own estate, her power taken over by Henry. Unfortunately, Henry had forgotten that basically nobody liked him, and fearing for his life, he begged Mary's mercy. When all was over, Mary managed to escape death and mutiny by the skin of her teeth. All while heavily pregnant, mind you. She made sure to write ironclad wills, decreeing that all power upon her death would go to her child, not Henry. James was born in Edinburgh on June 19, 1566, in Edinburgh Castle.
So, here we are at Edinburgh Castle, where King James was born. That's about it. I'm not actually going to go inside because I've already been in there, like several years ago. I'm not paying for it twice.
His arrival seemed to only worsen the tensions between his parents. For one thing, Henry was convinced that the real father was Riccio, and Mary wasn't really doing a good job convincing him that it wasn't. Henry even refused to attend James' baptism. His misfortunes would continue with a bout of what was likely syphilis and then smallpox. Almost as soon as he returned to good health, he was killed in an explosion at Kirkfield, or rather was strangled to death by James Hepburn, the then 4th Earl of Bothwell, and then an explosion happened. Mary grieved her Cringeville husband, and then married Lord Bothwell. Now, before you go thinking that Mary's the bad guy here, Bothwell was a total freak who had long been obsessed with her and subsequently sexually assaulted her, allegedly, forcing her to marry him. Mary was miserable and suicidal after the marriage, and soon after that, Edinburgh was captured by the Confederate lords, and Mary was imprisoned at Lochleven Castle. While there, her captors forced her to abdicate the throne. Thus, on July 29, 1567, at only 1 year old, James was crowned King James VI of Scotland. Several different regents served in James' stead until he grew old enough to manage royal duties on his own, and he was kept safe from danger at Stirling Castle, although he still suffered some health issues. And as he entered his teenage years, it became rapidly apparent that James was, well, a little fruity. A whole fruit basket, even. The first documented incident of his interest in men came with the arrival of Esme Stuart, the 6th Sieur d'Aubigny and first cousin of James' father in 1579. 13-year-old James immediately developed a wholly unhidden crush on this 37-year-old man. Hilariously, many people in James' circle were less concerned about James liking a man, an older and married one with kids at that, and more concerned that said man was, ew, Roman Catholic. Sir Henry Waddrington wrote, "James is in such love with him, as in the open sight of the people, oftentimes he will clasp him about the neck with his arms and kiss him." Of course, as a result, d'Aubigny obtained more political power. He was named Earl of Lennox, and fortunately for him and his upward trajectory, he agreed to convert to Protestantism. Not even converting, though, could save the Earl of Lennox from political strife, because you can convert religions, but nothing can cure you from the most shameful affliction of all: being French. After a long period of James being turned against him and being literally effectively imprisoned against his will, Lennox was forced to return to France. Within months, he was dead. It's not clear what exactly killed him, but his embalmed heart was sent back to Scotland to be given to James. James grieved bitterly, writing a very sexual symbolic poem in remembrance of Lennox. And in his grief, James decided that should anyone speak ill of Lennox and question his Christianity, they shall be put to death. Of course, this whole arc is a significant part of Mary and George, in the episode where James returns to Edinburgh to retrieve Lennox's heart, and George cheats on him, if you could call it that, when they're not like an exclusive couple, I guess. And James becomes jealous and wallows in his misery over his memories of Lennox, whom he calls the one man who truly loved him. This, of course, is a grandiose dramatization of the real events. We'll never know exactly how deep the feelings went in either direction for the two, and the show pointedly changes the ages of James and Lennox to make it less problematic, I guess. It also doesn't mention Lennox's wife and children, and from the very onset of the show, it also makes it rather unclear that by the time George enters the picture, James is also married to a woman, Princess Anne of Denmark. If you didn't already know the history, you could be forgiven for assuming that she's like his gal pal or something. Meanwhile, down in England, his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, was getting into all sorts of shenanigans, and she was named guilty of conspiracy against Queen Elizabeth I. There had long been strife between these two. Notably, Mary was Catholic and Elizabeth was Protestant, and the Catholic Church never officially recognized the marriage of King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's parents. Consequently, Catholics saw Elizabeth as an illegitimate ruler and usurper, so Elizabeth was always in many ways threatened by Mary's presence, and if Elizabeth had no children, Mary would claim the throne on her death. Or her children would. Elizabeth ordered her beheaded on February 8, 1587, at Fotheringay Castle. Although it seems like he did grieve, James had matters of his own to worry about. He apparently needed to find a wife. His attachment to various favorites who acted as his nightly bedfellows were causing people to question his masculinity and wonder if his dalliances with men would render him incapable of producing an heir, causing rumors to spread that James was, quote, too much carried by young men that lie in his bedchamber and are his minions. Nervous and desperate, he ended up marrying the 14-year-old Princess Anna of Denmark, who was wed to him by proxy in Denmark and then subsequently got lost at sea for weeks in 1589. When she finally made it back to Denmark, James rather romantically sailed out to meet her and be officially wed in Denmark. Together, they returned to Scotland. But here's where shit starts getting goofy, because if there's one thing the Danes were kind of obsessed with in the 16th and 17th century, it was witches. A thing that is going to pop up again in this story. When Anne's journey to Scotland went stormy and James too faced stormy seas heading to Denmark, a group of alleged Scottish witches took credit for conjuring said storms. As a result, somewhere between 70 to 100 accused witches were tortured and executed in Scotland. Over in Denmark, the Lutheran Church was more than happy to use witchcraft allegations as a political tool. After the Danish incident, James was interested in the troubles of witches and demons, publishing his book Demonology in 1597, covering a passionate case for the reality and threat of witchcraft, and theorizing that the end was nigh. Thus, Satan is acting up more. Of course, James' witch craze would be somewhat short-lived, but his religious nature continued. As we'll later see, James had been raised with a deep passion for theology, and his religious philosophizing would become a major part of his legacy. Despite the witchcraft stuff, though, things were not exactly smooth sailing in James and Anne's marriage. Upon the birth of their first son, Henry, James followed Scottish tradition, as he in youth experienced, by sending the infant prince to Stirling Castle to be cared for by the Erskine family. Anne was devastated, as this was certainly not the custom in Denmark, and wished that she could care for her own son. Poor Anne would in total birth 7 children, of whom only 3 made it past childhood, and suffered 3 miscarriages. In 1600, she gave birth to Charles, and Elizabeth before that in 1596. And though tensions between her and James would smooth out, she could never fully forgive him for the whole taking Henry away everything. As the 16th century gave way to the 17th, James succeeded Queen Elizabeth I to the throne of England, effectively unifying the two kingdoms. Thus began his endeavors to promote various favorites, to his court. Many of these early favorites, such as Sir Philip Herbert, the Earl of Montgomery, and Sir James Hay, were more platonic buddies than actual boyfriends. But then one day in 1607, a bodacious babe named Robert Carr was competing in a tournament and got badly injured, and as the king visited him during his recovery, the two became enamored of each other. Within a few years, Carr became appointed the Earl of Somerset, and James was making no effort to hide his affections from the public. With his notably close and sexual connection to the king, Carr, now Somerset, became increasingly interested in obtaining political power, which made him widely despised by most people, including James' wife, Queen Anne. But James' boyfriend gets what he wants, and he notably wanted to marry Frances Howard, the beautiful wife of the Earl of Essex. Together, the new couple convinced James to annul the marriage, and Somerset and Frances were wed in 1613. After the marriage, the relationship between James and Somerset grew cold and volatile. Somerset had basically gone mad with power and believed himself immune to failure. This left him blind to potential challenges to his political position, though, and that challenge came in 1614, when a handsome young man named George Villiers was introduced to the king. George Villiers was born in Leicestershire on August 28, 1592, to Sir George Villiers and his second wife, Mary Beaumont. George was one of many children to his father, and his mother came from a humble background. That is to say, a very poor one. She came from a poorer branch of the Beaumont family, and Sir George met her while she was working as a waiting woman for her more wealthy extended family. Although she had no money, she was extremely attractive. Mary's first son, John, was followed by her daughter, Susan, and then George was the third, and it became immediately apparent that he had been gifted with his mother's beauty. Unfortunately, he wasn't also gifted with, the gift of genius. He'd later prove to be politically gifted, sure, but he wasn't exactly a scholar. When his father passed away in 1606, Mary and her children were forced to move out as the estate went to Sir George's first marriage's eldest son. But unlike what the show tells us, Mary was not poor at this point due to her interest and jointure attached to the estate. She then married Sir William Rayner, who promptly died, and she earned a dower from that too. But although the family wasn't exactly broke, Mary was cognizant of how tenuous her position was, and knew that money was limited, and she sought to stabilize the family by marrying Sir Thomas Compton. This enabled her to take full advantage of George's potential and good looks by sending him to France to be educated in the arts of French, dancing, fencing, all of the talents of a courtier. George, now 16 years old, was thusly shipped off to France with his older brother and 4 servants in tow. He returned sometime around 1612, and by the time he reached maturity, there was no doubt that George was smoking hot. Catherine Thompson wrote in The Life and Times of George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, 1860, "The complexion of George Villiers was singularly clear and beautiful, his forehead high and smooth, his eyes dark and full of intelligence and sweetness, while the perfect oval of his face, the delicate turn of his features, fine yet noble, and the air of refinement which characterized both his countenance and his bearing, rendered him one of the most attractive of human beings. As he attained to maturity, a peculiar courtesy of manner, a frankness and merriment which diverged at times into a total forgetfulness of forms, a power of throwing off the appearance of all opposing business and secret cares. Although all of these he had his share, and of assuming a very pleasant and vacant face, a love of social life, and certain traits of character, half folly, irony, half romance. Won upon everyone that approached him before prosperity had changed courtesy into arrogance, or political intrigues marred the open expression of a physiognomy on which none could look without admiration. In 1614, when James was staying at Apethorpe House in Northamptonshire, he set eyes on George's beauty for the first time. George, now 21, immediately took James' affections. When writing of court news to his cousin, a close member of James' circle, Lord Fenton, noted, "I think your lordship has heard before this time of a youth. His name is Villiers, a Northamptonshire man. He begins to be in favor with his majesty." One thing that Mary and George heavily plays on that I can't not bring up is the insinuation that Mary was at least bisexual, with her sapphic lover in the show playing a major role in her schemes. Unfortunately, as exciting as it would be for this to be true, I have not been able to find any historical evidence for it. I think I can pinpoint where some potential confusion may have come up. Later in the 17th century, there was another Mary Villiers who was, allegedly, a bisexual adventuress who wore men's clothes and wrote sapphic poetry under the name Ophelia. So either these showrunners got these two mixed up, as I almost did, or they're just deliberately throwing unsubstantiated bisexuals at us for fun. Who knows? There's quite a lot in the show that heavily embellishes the historical facts or changes them. For example, Sir Francis Bacon didn't actually die of syphilis, but this one is so present in the plot that it actually serves to irritate me a little bit, just a little tiny bit. Another factor of her role in the show is this ever-looming threat of people finding out about her lowly origins, which doesn't make sense. The real Mary Beaumont was actually descended from gentry. Her family was just as highborn as Sir George Villiers was. It's just that they were broke. As she rose to power, the nobility hated her for her crassness and social climbing, and wrote all sorts of libelous things about her, so that's probably where that assumption in the show came from, so there's that. But even though she may not have been bisexual as far as we know, Mary Villiers was an extremely ambitious woman, and her plotting and scheming did, in the end, ensure the prosperity of her family. And George did indeed overtake Somerset as the king's favorite, spearheading his rise as one of the most powerful men in England. And Somerset was not happy with this shift, causing him to verbally and apparently physically abuse James at all hours. James felt his love for Somerset waning, writing to him in a letter in 1615, "You have, especially of late, since the stage frenzy took you, so powdered and mixed with strange streams of unquietness, passion, fury, and insolent pride, and, which is worst of all, with a settled kind of induced obstinacy, as it chokes and obscures all these excellent and good parts that God hath bestowed upon you. But if I ever find that you think to retain me by one sparkle of fear, all of the violence of my love will in that instant be changed into as violent a hatred. It lies in your hands to make of me what you please, either the best master and truest friend, or, if you force me once to call you ingrate, which the God of heaven forbid, no so great earthly plague can light upon you." So yeah, lots of assurance and lots of threats. And the groundwork was laid for Somerset's downfall, and George was ready to replace him. In a vain attempt to reconcile his two boys after knighting George and naming him Gentleman of the Bedchamber at Queen Anne's request, James asked George to go to Somerset and pledge his service and loyalty. George did, and Somerset's reply was firm. He said, "I will have none of your service, and you shall have none of my favor. I will, if I can, break your neck, and of that be confident." In response to this, George was like, "Oh, okay," and promptly went to go, shall we say, prove his love to the king. In his own words, George wrote to James, "I wonder whether you loved me now, better than at the time which I shall never forget at Farnham, where the bed's head could not be found between the master and his dog." To understand what actually caused the switch, we need to move back in time a little bit. So, this guy named Sir Thomas Overbury was Somerset's political advisor, and he correctly saw Francis Howard as a huge threat from all angles. Not just to his own connection to Somerset and the king, but also because Francis was a terrible influence. This made him rather loathed by James, who saw Overbury as a bad influence on Somerset. Admittedly, Overbury was also extremely well known to be a severe misogynist. He wrote this really embarrassing poem called The Wife that just sucks so bad. So obviously he had a lot of reasons for people to hate him, but that's not why he was allegedly murdered. James wanted him out, so he offered Overbury a foreign ambassadorship that would get his ass out of the UK, but when Overbury refused, James was like, okay, to the Tower with you then. So Overbury was hauled off to the Tower of London in 1613, where he died in September of that year after only a few months. Well, a couple years later, word reached James that Overbury had actually, in fact, been poisoned, and the whole plot had been orchestrated by none other than Somerset and his wife Frances, who had brought on a long string of people to do the deed. The two were convicted and sentenced to death at the Tower, but were in the end spared by James and instead held prisoner until 1622, when they were released and retired in the countryside. Now, the show Mary and George elaborates on this scandal quite a bit. It brings in the idea that Mary orchestrated the trial using evidence of witchcraft, and then implies that the two actually were put to death, all of which is, well, we don't really know if Mary was involved at all, never mind witchcraft. It's also hard to say for certain if Overbury really did die of poisoning, or if he simply caught some disease. If witchcraft was indeed involved, it was probably in the form of the sensational libelous writings published about Frances during the trial. Regardless, the scandal proved to be a double-edged sword for George. He had now risen to replace Somerset as the king's favorite, but he was also in a contentious position. The trial had thrust the king's courtiers into the limelight in a less than savory fashion, and from then on, they would all be under violent scrutiny. In 1615, James appointed George, who now earned the title of the Earl of Buckingham, as a gentleman of the bedchamber, master of the horse, and the king's private secretary. It seemed like George was earning considerable immunity in James's eyes, when it was revealed that George's mother had constructed violent methods to force the marriage of Sir Edward Coke's daughter to John, George's brother, who suffered from intense mental illness, and James seemed unmoved. He insisted that he loved George most of all, and that there was nothing wrong with him loving another man so much because, quote, just as Christ had his John, so he had his George. And truthfully, from all accounts, George genuinely loved James. It's hard to say if he was genuinely attracted to him sexually, or if he was entertaining that aspect of their relationship in order to uphold his position, but regardless, he was certainly far more enamored with and protective of James than Somerset ever was. And to prove his newfound power, George responded to threats with utmost intensity. When the family of Francis Howard intended to seek revenge by having a beautiful young man replace George as the king's favorite, George clapped back by telling James that Lady Suffolk was taking sneaky bribes, and the entire Howard family, found guilty of financial corruption, was ousted from power. George had proven that he would not be easy to attack or bring down. George's influence on the king only grew when in 1619 Queen Anne passed away, and James subsequently also fell ill, which worsened his already bad arthritis. In fact, James had long been in very poor health. He had stomach issues, kidney stones, possible porphyria, and he lost his teeth, which drove him to near alcoholism. His weak constitution meant that he physically relied on George to support him when walking, and George, too, had to take over some of James' political responsibilities. This meant that rather than persisting in trying to attack and oust George, people began to try and earn his favor. Despite all this, it could be said that James had a largely successful reign so far. There were difficulties, sure, but why wouldn't there be? But Europe was a very fraught place, and in 1618, the 30 Years' War broke out between damn near everybody in the continent, and war never makes for a very well-liked monarch, no matter how much or how little they're involved. Sorry, I'm like basically naked now. It started getting really hot in my apartment. Just pretend I'm channeling George Villiers in Mary and George in his like state of undress right now. So during the intense upheaval and war, George took on a huge number of political duties, which brought him ever closer to James's son, Prince Charles. This was beneficial to James, of course. It meant that even when James died, George would remain loyal and favored. And fortunately for George, he and Charles were heading a campaign against the Habsburgs of Spain. And if there was anyone the English nobles hated more than George, it was the Spaniards. And the French. So, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, yada yada. George and Charles intensely wanted to declare war on Spain and, pointedly, get Charles married to Henrietta Maria, the Princess of France, which was, of course, unpopular as she was very Catholic. They did indeed marry in the end, and then in 1620, Mary Villiers conspired to have George married too, by locking him in a room with Catherine Manners, the daughter of the Earl of Rutland. To save their reputations after this incident, the two were married in a private ceremony. The couple had 4 children, one of whom James became godfather to. But by this point, the slippery slope of the failing reputations of the Villiers clan and their royal counterparts was too fast to stop. To make matters worse, it became clear that James was not faring well and his time on Earth was probably short. He wrote to George, "I pray that we may make this at Christmas a new marriage, ever to be kept hereafter. I had rather live banished in any part of the earth with you, than live a sorrowful widow life without you." As 1625 drew on, James was overcome with fainting spells, fever, arthritis, gout, and very heavy drinking. Then, a stroke. After much horrid suffering, King James VI and I suffered from dysentery and passed away on March 27, 1625 at 58 years old. George would follow him only a few years later. Although George wasn't even present when the king died, he was on his way to Paris, rumors instantly spread that he had poisoned James due to James' unwillingness to follow George's wishes and declare war on Spain. It certainly didn't help his case that just before he had left for Paris, George had told James to take a new medicine that sadly worsened the king's condition, so... George was completely inconsolable, in near constant tears at the loss of his king. Charles, who had become extremely fond of George under the encouragement of James, gave him a great deal of comfort and swore to take his father's place in loving George. Unfortunately, Charles' affection for the highly unpopular George meant that his new tenure as king was already off to a pretty nasty start. But following James' wishes to be interred with his grand ancestors, his body was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey in a hilariously unnoticeable spot with a heavily eroded marker. I actually needed to ask 2 different staff members to help me find it, tucked away in this chapel under the footfall of thousands of tourists who are too distracted by the grandiose statues and altars in front of them that they don't realize that they're standing on top of a king, and an extremely notable one at that. Not just because of his sexuality and role in uniting the kingdoms, but because this is the King James responsible for the version of the Bible that we widely reference today, the King James Bible. There are many English translations of the Bible, all which take their own interpretation of the Hebrew text. Published in 1611, the KJV Bible was the result of the English churchman's belief that the existing versions of the Bible were corrupt and employed many inconsistencies. In 1604, James employed a final roundup of 47 scholars to revise the translations, each working on separate sections of the text. The KJV Bible was widely regarded as a more accurate translation, at least based on what they had available at the time, for centuries until the early 1900s, when it fell into dispute again because new sources were discovered and new versions were published. But ironically, the KJV Bible is still used by many Christian fundy groups. It's no wonder why this version became the dominant one. It was published after the invention of the printing press, making it extremely easy to mass produce and distribute. The obvious issue here, though, is reckoning the KJV Bible and its use as a tool of furthering homophobic policy. with its famously queer king. There's also a lot more recent discourse about this topic in general, centered largely around the RSV Bible, discussed in a documentary that came out in 2022 called 1946, The Mistranslation That Shifted Culture, which focuses on the translation error in 1946 that inserted the word homosexual into the Bible's prohibitions. Now, the discourse surrounding this is massive. I don't claim to be a Bible expert, nor do I actually really care, so I'm not going to get into all that right now, but the point is the irony. You have to admit it's a little funny. After all, James was so famously fruity that after the KJV was published, it became jokingly dubbed the Queen James Bible. So James was gone, and in his place was his unpopular son, clearly under the influence of George, the famously corrupt lover of kings. What could possibly go wrong? For all intents and purposes, let's just say that the next several years following James' death were not very good politically for George. He and the new King Charles I, by the late 1620s, were caught up in some rather extreme scandals, prompting outbursts of Parliament, like this one according to one reporter. Such a spectacle of passions as the like had seldom been seen in such an assembly, some weeping, some expostulating, some prophesizing the fatal ruin of our kingdom, some playing the divines and confessing their own and country's sins, which drew those judgments upon us, some finding it as it were fault with those that wept and expressing their blood and courageous resolutions against the enemies of the king and kingdom. In short, every goddamn guy in the English Parliament and nobility hated George and were quick to use him as a scapegoat, even in the few situations where it was unwarranted, of which there weren't a whole lot. Sir Edward Coke exclaimed, "The Duke of Buckingham is the man. As long as he sits in Parliament, we shall never sit here or go hence with honour. Let us present this as a grievance of grievances. Present him to the king. Set down the causes of all our disasters, and all will reflect upon him." Edward Curtin furthered the theory that George intended to overthrow the king. "He has gotten all of our ships, force into his hands. He makes us all slaves." But politics stops for no drama, and George had work to do. Charles ordered him to head down to Portsmouth to oversee the gathering of Navy fleets for a military operation, and so he did. The vibe in Portsmouth was already a bit glum. Even before he got there, in early summer 1628, one of George's confidants, Dr. John Lamb, was attacked and murdered for associating with George. To make things even more uneasy, a goofy little song arose from the incident as a threat. "Let Charles and George do what they can. The Duke shall die like Dr. Lamb." But George frankly had shit to do, so off to Portsmouth he went, taking residence in the Greyhound Inn, which is still here to this day under the name the Spotted Dog Inn. Shortly after his arrival, George was attacked by a sailor, but quick-witted as always, he jumped up and apprehended the man, dragging him back to the inn where he could be held prisoner. The guy was let free, however, and in a scuffle following, George tried to scare the sailors out of their mutiny by having a few violent actors executed publicly. I guess you're shocked to find out that didn't go well. On the night of August 22nd, George fell ill and went to his rooms to rest, where the king met him and the two shared what an onlooker described as an unusual and passionate embrace. By the next morning, George was in high spirits and went downstairs to have a quick breakfast before heading out. According to legend, as he exited the parlor where a crowd was gathered, he met Colonel Thomas Fryer, who bowed to him. George bowed back, and as he straightened up, a man reached around Fryer and plunged a knife into George's chest. George screamed, "Villain!" and pulled the knife out, but it was too late. He collapsed, already dead, and his wife Catherine, who was very pregnant, arrived downstairs just in time to see his body hurgling up a bunch of blood. Meanwhile, John Felton, the assassin, was attempting to escape, but the onlookers had assumed he was a French agent and were hot on his ass screaming, "A Frenchman! A Frenchman!" You kind of have to laugh that him being French was a worse offense than him killing the Duke of Buckingham, and he wasn't even French. Anyway, he was caught, and Charles wept bitterly at the death of his closest favorite. and the love of his father. When I went to Portsmouth to stay in this inn where George died, it was an incredibly surreal experience.
Apologies for how much of a mess I look right now. I made the completely just bonkers decision to walk from the Portsmouth and Southsea train station to Ye Spotted Dog. You know, if I didn't have my heavy luggage, it would have been fine. Unfortunately, I did have my heavy luggage. So tired. Anyway, I am at Ye Spotted Dog in the Oak Room. Now, the owner has informed me later he will show me the dagger, what killed him, and I'm very excited about that. For now, I need to unsweatyify myself.
The owner was extremely kind and was so enthusiastic about the history. He even brought out the murder weapon itself, which is still there, and told me I could hold it. Of course, there's some contention around this knife. Some people question its validity due to a few illustrations that portray a different knife, but the owner explained to me that this specific knife that killed George was personally sent to Charles, where he kept it safe until years later, when it was forgotten and then rediscovered and auctioned off, and then the town of Portsmouth bought it, and it ended up back at Ye Spotted Dog Inn. Then, several years ago, the inn was robbed and the thief took the knife, but it was tracked down by locals and recovered hidden in somebody's garage. It's so interesting how this knife always seems to make its way back here to the scene of the crime. I stayed there for one night in this room, which the owner believes is right next to the actual spot where George was stabbed. It's hard to say for certain, but I thought, you know, on the off chance that George's spirit is still here, I have a few questions.
As of recording this, I actually haven't watched Mary and George yet. Do you think if I watch it in here, he'll get mad? I guess we'll find out. Here's another problem I forgot to take into account. I'm basically half deaf, so if George is speaking to me right now, I probably just can't fucking hear him. So maybe I wasn't the best person to be going on this endeavor.
All right. Am I feeling a presence? No. But give it a minute. George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, if you are with us in here in this room, say your name, perhaps. George, did you truly love King James, or were you just seeking power? Another question for you, George. Do you regret any of the things you did in your life, or do you have no shame at all? George, what's your opinion on the new season of Drag Race? George, were you a top or a bottom? The world really wants to know this. That was just step one of the investigation. And now, of course, now that I've touched the dagger, I am in fact cursed, so there's that. He might contact me later, or maybe while I'm sleeping here tonight, he will make contact with me through a demonic hellscape dream. It wouldn't be the first time that's happened to me. I don't know if I've ever said this on camera before, but when I was researching J.C. Leyendecker, I came down with a crazy fever, and in my fever dream, I was contacted by the ghost of Frank Leyendecker, and he had some choice words to say to me, so that was...
Hey, I'm sexy as fuck and I'm freaky.
Morning update. No, I didn't experience any paranormal phenomena in the night. Which I didn't think I would. Back to London I go.
Anyway, it was a really strange experience walking around Portsmouth. The city is full of references to George, even though they hated him so much back then.
One thing I've noticed so far about Portsmouth, the Duke of Buckingham is like their special boy. His name is everywhere.
In fact, the inn's owner let me know that the church down the street even has a reliquary for George containing his preserved guts.
So, the owner of my hotel told me that some of his intestines are in there.
Cool. But all in all, if you find yourself in Portsmouth, definitely consider staying at Ye Spotted Dog. It was a lovely experience, the folks who run it are delightful, and they deserve the love. So, George's embalmed body was sent back to London and buried by torchlight in Westminster Abbey, just beside James. Hilariously, George's resting spot is far more extravagant and noticeable than James's is. He couldn't be missed. It was erected by Catherine, his widow, with an epitaph insisting that George was just misunderstood. But I suppose in the end, it's poetic that they found each other again in death. As for Felton, the assassin, he was put to death after trial. Songs popped up across the kingdom praising him for killing George, calling him England's savior. But George himself had been a difficult figure to reckon with in cultural memory. He was indeed a really problematic guy who made tons of enemies, but it's also true that he was blamed for some unwarranted things too. And I do think he ought to be credited for his role as the most important person in James' life. That's undeniable. For all of their faults, they were indeed a power couple for the ages.
All this and I'm editing and I realized that I kind of didn't wrap up my final thoughts on the show. I kind of share the opinion of the historian Pete Langman as he wrote in his article on the subject, where he says, "Those who know their history will find it makes no sense, and those who don't will not be able to make any sense of it, and that's a major flaw for any drama, historical or otherwise." I had a lot of fun watching Mary and George. The problem is it kind of suffers from very similar issues that a lot of similar biopics or historical dramas suffer from. It's kind of a similar thing that happened in Chevalier. They kept trying to sort of follow the historical canon, but then took wildly different routes in directions that I don't understand why they went in that direction, when what actually happened in real history is either just as interesting or more interesting. And so as a result, it has all these loose ends and things that I'm not really sure why it was there, and it kind of just serves to make things a little more confusing. So where does that leave us? Well, it's a fun show, but definitely don't assume you can learn the nitty-gritty of true history from it. And unfortunately, that's kind of an issue we're going to continue suffering from whenever we get one of these shows. Have fun, don't think you're learning anything.
Thank you for learning with me about a king and his favorite. Have any of you watched Mary and George? If so, what did you think about it? Personally, I really enjoyed it, even though it added a bunch of stuff that never happened, and I think they're cowards for not giving Nicholas Gallatin George's stupid little mustache. But, you know, hard to find a perfect biopic in general, so I take what I can get, and I'm not mad. But please don't watch it thinking that it's like an accurate portrayal. Anyway, also thank you to Ye Spotted Dog Inn for accommodating me and being so helpful, and also helping me carry my heavy-ass suitcase up and down those ancient stairs. I owe you guys my life. So until next time, wash thy hands, wear thy mask, and keep your enemies close, but your king closer.